In 2000, there was a movie that came out that was called Return to Me. Some of you may have seen the movie, or you may not. But it was the story of a man. He and his wife were a happily married couple, and they were coming home from a dinner one night, and they were in a car wreck, and his wife died, and she was an organ donor. And her heart was saved and transplanted into another body. A few years later, the man is finally getting on with his life, and his friends are encouraging him to start dating, and he's not quite comfortable with it, but he does end up going out on a date. And while he's on the date with this one woman, he meets the waitress at this particular restaurant. Of course, the romance is that he falls in love with the waitress. And they have this wonderful relationship for a while, and she's sitting in his room one day and sees that there's a letter on the desk that she had written, because she was the one that received the heart transplant. The story was, of course, that the wife of his heart had returned to him. The idea of return to me, of course, was put into the song by Dean Martin years and years ago. But the idea that the heart, once given to someone, sometimes it leaves, but the challenge is that it can come back, that it can return to me. That's what we see in the book of Amos. When we start to think about Amos and its great message, like most prophets, Amos warns the people of God about their decaying relationship with God that would guarantee them destruction. However, Amos brings his audience full circle from faithfulness to that wickedness and then back to faithfulness again. It looks like it might be the message of gloom to those, of course, who do not, or who trust in themselves and don't trust in God. But in reality, it is also a message of great hope for those who place their trust in the Lord, who return unto God in that most opportune time. Amos, as a person, prophesied during the reign of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and also during the reign of King Jeroboam II of Israel. The overlap of those two kings occurs from about 767 BC down to about 753 BC. So somewhere in 760 to 755 or so is where Amos is prophesying. And he gives us that information, of course, in Amos 1 and verse 1. In that same verse, he refers to himself as a herdsman of Tekoa, or one who was following the sheep in Tekoa. Tekoa was a city about 12 miles south of Jerusalem. Of course, we know what a shepherd is, one who herds the flocks of sheep, putting them up at night and leading them to green pastures to eat during the day, protecting them from the wolves. And in a very real sense, that job helped Amos prepare for this time in which God called him to be a prophet. In chapter 7 and verse 14, Amos also mentions that he was a dresser of the sycamore figs. These were wild figs that would grow out in the landscape, and kind of to offset his income as a herdsman, he would go and he would prepare or dress the sycamore trees. In that particular region, the fruit of that sycamore tree, which is different than our sycamore tree here, but the fruit of that tree would grow to a certain stage, and the husk would begin to constrict the fruit. So in order to make this fruit grow larger, they would come and they would pinch the fruit, or the husk, bruise it, so that it would loosen the husk and the fruit could expand. The person who did that was the dresser of a sycamore tree, and that's what Amos would do. He herded the sheep and he pinched the fruit, and it was enough to prepare him for the Lord. Often we hear Amos referred to as the roaring prophet, because he starts in chapter 1 and verse 2 with the roar of the Lord. In chapter 3 and verse 4, he refers to the roaring of the lion. Again, in chapter 3 and verse 8, the roaring of the lion. His message to Israel is that of the warning cry of God. And even though he grew up south of Jerusalem in the southern kingdom of Judah, he prophesies to the northern kingdom of Israel that had lost their way. And as we read the book of Amos, we cannot help but be amazed by the message of injustice. How often the nation of Israel is indicted for their cruelty, for their oppression, for their greed, for their self-interest over the needs and wants of others as well. And so it is a cry against the social injustice of Israel. But let's look at this full circle of Amos. As we begin, we see, first of all, this roaring of the Lord. As we open our Bibles to Amos chapter 1, we see that cry of the Lord, or the roar of the Lord, comes in verse 2. This is how He is going to come out against this nation that has left their people. But it says that for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not hold back my judgment. In fact, he would say that in verse 3. In verse 6, he would say, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4. For 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4. Each one is a city or a nation, a people surrounding the nation of Israel. In fact, if you were to take a map of Palestine, and you start with Damascus, which was to the northern parts of the region of Israel. And he says that Damascus was warned for their cruelty against Gilead, one of the small cities of the land of Palestine, the Israelite cities. Gilead was known for its healing balms and medicines. That's why Jeremiah would ask, is there no balm in Gilead? We sing the song, there is a balm in Gilead. There is the healing touch of God in Gilead. And so here is this city which is known for its healing, for its curative powers, for reaching out to people, not just Israelites, but anyone who would come to Gilead would find healing within its gates. And yet here is the nation of Damascus, the Syrians, who are oppressing and crushing and destroying this bountiful city of healing. For 3 transgressions, in verse 6, of Gaza, and for 4, and they are indicted for delivering people to the Edomites. You may remember the Edomites all the way back from when we did the lesson on Obadiah. Obadiah is a book, a 1-chapter prophecy to the nation of Edom. And they are noted for their pride and their cruelty. Not only were they oppressing the people of God and all of those around them, but it says here that they had help. That Gaza, in order to maybe stave off the attack of Edom, said, well, I'll tell you what, if you'll leave us alone, we'll deliver these people into your hands. And so they made a pact with Edom, and they delivered these people into the hand of the Edomites. Gaza was part of the coast of the Mediterranean Sea toward the southwestern part of the land of Palestine. Tyre was on the northwestern corner of the land of Palestine. They're also warned for delivering a nation into the hand of the Edomites. And then in chapter 1, verse 11, he says, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not hold back their punishment because of their cruel behavior toward Israel. How he says that your anger or your wrath went unquenched. You refused to hold it back from people, and you continued to fight and fight and fight, even when they were already down. It wasn't just about victory, it was about utter cruelty to you. Edom, of course, was just south of the Dead Sea. You can see what's happening. God is targeting all the nations and the lands around the land of Israel. He's painting a large target on the promised land. At the end of chapter 1, he gets closer to home. For 3 transgression of the Ammonites, and for 4, seeking, he says that they were seeking to leave Israel without offspring, ripping open those who were with children. In chapter 2, he begins with Moab. Ammon and Moab, remember, were the sons of Lot. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, these were the 2 that were born to Lot and his daughters. And they were somewhat related to the nation of Israel. Of course, Edom were descendants of Esau, who were the very brother of Israel. These were the ones that should have looked upon them with grace, and yet they were the ones that seemed to me most cruel. Moab, in chapter 2, seething anger and revenge toward Edom. Edom was cruel, even to Moab. And they were going to repay them pound for pound for 3 transgressions of Judah. What was their problem? They walked no more after the judgments of God. They were God's people, the chosen ones. They should have been leading the paths of righteousness, and yet they had left those righteous paths. And then he comes in chapter 2 and verse 6, for 3 transgressions of Israel. It's as if they're reading this and they're seeing all these other nations, and the Israelites say, yeah, you go get them, God. Oh, Edom, oh, how cruel they were. God, they deserve whatever you give to them. Moab, of course, God, they deserve what you give. And then God says, and for you, Israel. 3 transgressions, and for 4. The idea is that 3 transgressions would fill the cup, but 4 is overflowing. We talk about the great blessings of God in Psalm 23, my cup runneth over. But this is not the cup running over with blessings. This is their cup running over with iniquity against God. The Lord then has already, He is warning them that you need to change. Why? Notice there in the second part of chapter 2, he talks about the Amorites, not the Ammonites, the Amorites. And that nation, he says, I've already destroyed them. I've already brought them to nothing. And you're not learning the lesson of the Amorites. If I will destroy them, I will destroy you. So the Lord roars in justice towards those who sin against Him. Like that warning that 3 transgressions, and for 4 I will not revoke or withhold the punishment. The Lord does not send prophets forth for no reason. He says, does the lion roar when it has no prey? Chapter 3 and verse 4. No, the lion roars when he has a prey. Does the bird fall into a snare when no trap is set? No. Does the trap release when nothing has set it off? These were rhetorical questions that Amos is asking, and he's saying, do you think I'm sending prophets for no reason? Do you think I just wanted to have these men go and call? He says, I'm sending them out because there is prey. He says in chapter 3 and verse 10, talking about the people of Israel, they do not know how to do right. We could trace that back to a failure of the leaders of the nation and the priest, to the leaders of the nation and the princes. We could trace it back to the leaders of the homes and the parents. But after generation and generation of not doing what was right, God says they do not know how to do what is right. So God promises an utter destruction against them. Hear and testify against the house of Jacob, declares the Lord, the God of hosts, that on the day that I punish Israel for his transgression, I will punish the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar will be cut off and fall to the ground, and I will strike the winter house, and I will, along with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall come to an end, declares the Lord. Everything in which they put their trust and their hope, their prosperity, God says is going to be cut off. Their false altars. Remember, under the Old Testament system, it was Moses had constructed the altar, and there were the horns on the altars that would come off, and certain times, certain sacrifices, the blood would be sprinkled over those horns. Excuse me. It was a time of sacrament and separation. But God says, your sacrifices are so unwanted to me, they're so unworthy, that I will cut off those horns and they will fall to the ground. That which should have been the holiest part of the altar is destroyed. And so the Lord is seen roaring from heaven. But secondly, we see His call to them to prepare to meet God. The nation was so oppressive to the underprivileged and to the poor. So God despised their offering. In chapter 4, first 5 verses there, he talks about how they crushed the needy, how they oppressed the poor. He said, come to Gilgal and offer your sacrifices, and to Bethel and give your tithes. Do all of this even though it was improper. It was the wrong place. It was the wrong time. It was the wrong sacrifices. And God says the reason why is not because I want it. But chapter 4 and verse 5, he says, for so you love to do. How often we fall into the trap of doing what we want to do. What we like, what we think feels good, or God will surely bless. So God begins to remove His hand of blessing from them. I gave them cleanness of teeth and want of bread in all of their cities. Verse 6 and 7. Yet, he says, you have not returned to me. I gave them crop failures and famine. You think about what God is doing, it's not the horrible thing. It's that all of those things originally were blessings from God. And now He's withholding His hand from them. As a result, they were becoming impoverished and poor, famine. Just like the very ones that they were oppressing and crushing. And he says in chapter 14, or chapter 4 and verse 13, because I will do this to you, O Israel, prepare to meet your God, O Israel. Just like the song says, careless soul, why will you linger, wandering from the fold of God? Hear you not the invitation? Prepare to meet your God. A line right here from Amos 4 and verse 12. Prepare to meet your God. And then he reveals to us what God He is. The Lord of hosts. I command an army. You are meeting me on the battlefield. You prepare to meet God. How do you prepare to meet God on a battlefield like that? And the answer is through repentance. Notice in chapter 5, he gives us the answer, beginning in verse 4. Seek me and live. Do not seek Bethel. The significance of Bethel was that when Jeroboam the son of Nebat, Jeroboam the first, removed the nation to the north and divided the kingdom, he set up 2 altars, one at Dan in the northern part of his territory, and one at Bethel in the southern part of his territory. Golden calves, similar to the ones that Aaron had made when they came up out of the land of Egypt. And he says, come to me and live. Don't go to this false place of worship and fall down before the golden calf and the idols that are powerless. Don't go there. Don't go to Gilead. Yes, it is balm town. It is that town of healing. But don't go there, because what they offer is not the kind of healing that you need. Seek me and live. Chapter 5 and verse 6, he repeats it again. Seek the Lord and live. In chapter 18 again, chapter 14, he says, seek good and not evil, that you may live. How? He's calling them, return to me. Then he spends the end of chapter 5, beginning in verse 18, and then in chapter 6, verses 1 and verse 4, pronouncing a woe. Woe to those who approach the day of judgment without proper respect for the magnitude of their sin and their own unworthiness. Woe unto you who say, bring on the day of judgment. I'm ready. Because he says you're not ready. Woe unto you who are at ease in Zion, resting as the wealthy on the backs of the poor. So in chapter 3, he gives us, in chapter 7, he begins a series of visions of destruction. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, he talks about the devouring locusts that come in and eat everything, reminiscent of Joel that we studied before. In verses 4 through 6, he talks about the flaming fire that comes and consumes everything in its path. In verses 7 through 9, he talks about the plumb line as God measures the city and holds it to the standard of His Word. In chapter 8, and beginning in verse 1, he talks about this vision of the summer fruit that has passed its ripeness and begins to ruin and spoil. And then in chapter 9, he talks about the judgment of the Lord. Each one is a warning of the impending destruction that is going to come. Most of them begin with the phrase, "This is what the Lord God showed me. This was the vision. This is what I saw." And you can imagine Amos was not a very popular person, because the visions he saw were all about destruction. Then it finally becomes full circle. After the picture that he sees of God standing by the altar and about to judge this nation in chapter 9, verses 1 through 10, we see a vision of promise, of prosperity, of peace that is made to this erring nation. Chapter 9 and verse 11, in that day. Very similar to Joel's language, in those days, in the last days. In fact, this phrase comes a lot in the prophets. In that day, I will raise up the booth of David, the tent of David that is fallen, and repair its breaches. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. The harvest would be so plentiful, he said, that the plowman would catch up to the reaper, that the treaders of the grape wouldn't even finish their job when they were starting to sow the field again. It was a vision of prosperity. And the righteous would be protected by God. God said, I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted out of the land that I have given to them. Chapter 9 and verse 15. Looking forward to the last days, the days of the church, the days in which we live, and the promise of peace and prosperity, righteousness is given to us. We will not be uprooted out of the land that God has planted us. And a vision similar to that, Matthew would say, or Jesus would tell us in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 13, every plant which my Father has not planted shall be uprooted. But not us, not the Christian, who trusts wholeheartedly in God. And that message of Amos continues to us. God does not take kindly to greed and injustice and cruelty. We will be judged by how we treat other people, especially those that can do nothing for us, those who are oppressed, or those who are poor, or those who are needy. We're not talking about the pseudo-social justice of modern day, but we're talking about true principles of pride and self-trust and greed that continue to threaten mankind today. You trust in the mountains of Samaria, he says in chapter 4. You trust in yourselves. I know all of us fall to sin at times. And when we do, it is a battle that we declare against God, the God who loves us and desires the very best for us. And He has made all provisions for our salvation, for our peace, for our spiritual prosperity. And so God continues the same call that He gave to them. Therefore, thus will I do unto you, O Israel, and because I will do this to you, prepare to meet your God. God is saying, in effect, return to me. Our hearts have been severed from a God who loved us, who led us, who created us in spiritual perfection and purity. And it's drifted away. It's been lost from Him. And He calls to us, return to me. Tonight you have an opportunity to reunite your heart with God. If you're not a child of God, by all means, let's make it right. Being baptized for the remission of your sins, God will add you to His church. He will reunite with your heart. But maybe you're a child of God and you've struggled or you've wandered away. You're backsliding, as we sometimes say. It's time to get a grip. Get traction and come back to God. Will you return to Him tonight while we stand and while we sing?